Hello, everyone. Are you one of those people who saw a bunch of angry people walking out of a building with a sign COP29 and later seeing a breaking news $300 billion deal reached and wondering what exactly is happening here? Well, if you give me a few minutes, I'll tell you all there is to know about COP, what the whole climate finance talk is about, and what exactly was causing that roar that you saw. Now, COP stands for Conference of Parties. And by parties, we're talking about countries that are signed up or that are parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And by that, I mean countries that have come together, not just countries, scientists, campaigners, people who care about climate change, who have come together or who come together yearly. I think the first one was held in 1995. So people come together yearly to deliberate and discuss about how to tackle the climate change problems, how to build resilience, how to support developing countries so that they can cut down on carbon emission and also tackle the imminent or the present problems caused by climate change. So, COP29 is the 29th edition of this conference, and that's why it's called COP29. We just rounded off in Azerbaijan, in Baku. I think the name of the town is Baku, in Azerbaijan. Now, this climate change conference is a very important gathering, and I will explain why. When we talk about emissions and global warming and climate change, you have to picture it as us being in a closed, massive house. So, if someone in, say, room 10 decides to cut down on their emission, and the guy in room 11 decides to boost or increase their emission, the impact is going to be the same on everyone. If, for instance, the United Kingdom, like it's currently doing, continues to cut down on emission and China just keeps going on about emissions, it's not going to have that much impact because at the end of it all, we are all together in the same problem. So COP is an opportunity for everyone to come together so that we can have a uniform front in addressing the problem so that some countries would cut down or would develop their resources while reducing emission. The problem, therefore, becomes one of inequality because we would look at some numbers very soon, but inequality comes into the conversation, and every conversation that has to do with inequality, it can get very, very tricky and very heated in no time. So that's why COP29 was a particularly sensitive and heated conversation. Among other things, the main points of contention or the main sticking points was one, climate finance, cutting down on emissions, and building resilience. Now, climate finance simply means pulling funds together to supporting developing countries so that they can cut down on their emission and also tackle the current problems that climate change has brought upon nations. I'm talking about droughts, floods, and all sorts of things that are happening across the world. This, however, is quite tricky because some of the most impacted countries in the world now are the least contributors to the emission that is causing the problem. And this has to be looked at from two directions. So we have to look at the historic accumulation of emission over the long, how many hundreds of years. And also the ongoing emission that has to be cut down. One of the things that drives the current ongoing emission is development. Now, developing countries would one day want to be like developed countries. Developed countries have taken advantage of fossil fuel and very non-clean, dirty sources of energy to build their countries to where it is today. And we call them developed countries. So if they now turn back and tell developing countries to say, you know what, you have to cut down on emission. The question from the developing countries then becomes, wait a minute, You rode on the wings of fossil fuel to become developed. And today, you are telling us to cut down on emission. Isn't that a trick to keep us poor forever? Some leaders, including the leader of Azerbaijan, have also gone as far as saying, actually, this whole climate change conversation is actually some trick to keep poor countries poor forever. There's nothing like climate change. It's just a hoax, a myth to keep them poor. But the evidence is not in support of that position, because there are increased frequencies, increased strength of these natural disasters that we are currently dealing with. So it's practically impossible at this point to deny climate change. But the concerns that these developing countries are raising is one that we have to look at. Now, the second area to look at is the historic accumulation of emission. But let's even come back to the ongoing emissions that we're dealing with. If we look at a few numbers, the 4 top polluting group of countries or entities. So I'm talking about the United States of America, China, India, and the 28 European Union countries. If we put those 4 blocks together, in 2022 alone, those 4 entities were responsible for 56% of the emissions that we have to deal with. If you stretch that to the 20 top polluting countries, that number increases to 83% of the emission in 2022 alone. Now, that begins to give you an idea of the inequality that I'm talking about. Let's look at the historic aspects of emission. And by historic, I'm talking about how much emission has been accumulating over the years in this big house that I've just talked about. Remember, we have to deal with all that because it's all part of the problem. The data I had access to looked at emission in the last 266 years. That's from 1751 to 2017. And that data shows that the United States of America alone is responsible for 25% of that emission. China, 12.7% of that emission. The EU, 28 EU countries, responsible for 22% of that emission. Russia, responsible for 6% of the emission. Japan, 6% of the emission. And India, 3%. Although these 6 countries put together, responsible for 73% of the historic accumulation of emission in the last 266 years. Now, let's contrast that to the entire continent of Africa. In that period that I just talked about, 266 years, the entire continent of Africa contributed just 3% of that accumulated emission. So what that tells you is the entire continent of Africa only contributed half of what Russia contributed, not to talk about China and the United States of America. So that's another dimension to the inequality. And like I said earlier, the most hit countries by the impact of this problem are actually some of these least contributing countries. So if we begin to look at the intricacies and the complication of this conversation, then you begin to understand why some people left the conference saying, well, the move from the current $100 billion to $300 billion is actually a big leap in the right direction. But those from these developing countries are very frustrated and angry because by the UN's calculation, the amount of money needed to support these developing countries beginning from next year, 2025, is supposed to be $1.1 trillion. And that number, by the United Nations calculation, should increase to $1.8 trillion by 2030. So a deal that ends with $300 billion yearly from 2035, some would argue, doesn't even begin to touch the sides of the problem. But if we flip this conversation the other side, as someone who lives in a developed country currently, I see people who are dying from energy poverty. I see homeless people on streets. I see people suffering from extreme poverty. Now, this, if we talk about percentage, might be a very small percentage of the population, but the fact remains that these people exist. So how would it feel for those people to see their country putting funds into supporting other countries to develop their infrastructures? But again, how do you tell those developing countries not to do whatever they like, irrespective of their mission, if you do not support them? So you see how dicey and how complicated the nuances of this conversation can become. And that's why some experts, and I think I'm one of those people who are beginning to think that COP29 might actually be the last COP, because just imagine how heated the next conversation about climate finance is going to be. Well, hopefully by these conversations, you'll begin to see how difficult these things are to address. My personal opinion is that 300 billion is a move in the right direction. COP itself, that brings everybody together to try to solve this problem as one, for me, is another great achievement. But whether these conversations can continue going on or not is one for the ages. And so, at this point, I'd like to invite you to leave comments. What do you think? $300 billion? Good enough? Not good enough? Are we moving in the right direction? What do you think? Leave comments in the comment section. And please don't forget to like, share, and distribute this conversation so we can create awareness. Once again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers.